Oops, the words spoken with the lightest, most feigned innocence, sliced through the elegant murmur of the Boston Annual Charity Gala. It came from Victoria Hartwell, whose smile revealed perfect teeth and a rotten heart. A splash of deep crimson, a full glass of Cabernet blossomed across the pristine white uniform of the waitress in front of her. The red wine splattered like blood on fresh snow. For Victoria Hartwell, wife of real estate mogul Robert Hartwell, this gala was her personal catwalk. She lived a life of endless spa treatments and shopping sprees that cost more than most people's annual salaries. In her world, service staff were invisible, obstacles to be moved. This young black waitress in particular had seemed just a little too poised, a little too graceful, and Victoria felt a sudden, cruel urge to put her in her place. 19 years of marriage into extreme wealth had taught her that she could get away with anything. She watched with cruel satisfaction as the waitress, Jasmine, gasped and desperately tried to dab the liquid from her skirt. "What a pity," Victoria said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, her voice dripping with venom, "that people like you don't know how to move properly in civilized settings." But Victoria's 19 years of untouchable privilege had just run into a wall it couldn't break. This act of public racial humiliation wasn't just an accident, it was an assault. And Victoria could never have imagined that the invisible waitress she had just attacked was a Harvard MBA student, that her millionaire husband was watching the entire scene with cold realization, and that every toxic word she spoke was being meticulously recorded for a thesis that would soon become the evidence that would destroy her entire world. Jasmine felt the icy shock of the Cabernet soak through the thin, white fabric of her uniform, clinging instantly to her skin. It was cold, but not as cold as the sudden, dead silence that fell over the nearby tables. The elegant ballroom, moments before just a backdrop of crystal chandeliers and the discreet murmur of the East Coast elite, suddenly snapped into sharp, unforgiving focus. She could feel dozens of eyes landing on her, a mixture of appalled pity, faint embarrassment, and, from a few, the detached amusement of those watching a free, cruel show. This was Victoria Hartwell's stage, and Jasmine had just been violently cast as the fool. A hot flush of humiliation rose up her neck, fighting for dominance, but she willed it down. Crying was not an option. Reacting emotionally was not an option. Jasmine Washington had not clawed her way through scholarships and relentless work to her final semester at Harvard Business School by reacting. She had made it by thinking. She had been raised on the south side of Chicago by a single mother who worked 3 jobs. A woman who taught her that true strength was never loud. True strength didn't shout back at the landlord or curse the broken-down bus that made you late for work. It observed, it endured, it learned, and it waited for the precise, right moment to act. This woman, Victoria, was just a different kind of bully, draped in diamonds instead of worn-out denim. The strategy, Jasmine knew, remained the same. Let the opponent reveal their entire hand. She took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying the tremor she felt in her fingers. She would not give this cruel, pampered woman the satisfaction of seeing her break. "I'm very sorry, ma'am," she said. Her voice was perfectly even, professional, and startlingly clear in the manufactured quiet. The utter lack of hysteria, tears, or anger seemed to irritate Victoria even more than an outburst would have. Jasmine bent down, her movements graceful and measured despite the dripping, ruined skirt, to pick up the large, sharp shards of the heavy wine glass Victoria had so clearly dropped on purpose. "I will have this cleaned up immediately," Victoria scoffed, a sound like tearing silk. She waved a dismissive hand, her massive canary diamond catching the light and flashing it like a weapon. "Don't bother with the glass. A busboy can get that." Her gaze raked over Jasmine's stained uniform with theatrical disgust. "Just get that hideous stain out of my sight. Go. Find a different uniform, or just leave." Then, satisfied that she had regained control and the attention of her peers, she turned back to her captivated audience of socialites. She raised her voice just enough to ensure the surrounding tables heard every condescending word. "I imagine," she projected, "that accidents like this are common when you hire this kind of people for important events. It really does lower the tone of the entire evening, doesn't it?" As Jasmine straightened up, the sharp, glittering shards of the broken glass held carefully in a linen napkin, she did not look at Victoria. Instead, her gaze lifted, scanning the room for the nearest service station, and for a split second, her eyes locked with those of a man seated at the main head table. He was older, elegant, with graying hair at his temples, and a face that was completely, unnervingly still. He wasn't laughing like the others. He wasn't wincing in pity. He was just watching. This was Robert Hartwell, the name whispered with awe in Boston's financial circles. He had built a real estate empire from nothing, based on one simple, unwavering rule. You learn everything about a person by watching them when they think no one is paying attention. And at this moment, he was paying rapt attention. He had seen the entire sordid affair. He had seen his wife, Victoria, angle her body. He had seen the deliberate, petty flick of her wrist. He had seen the manufactured surprise and the cruel, satisfied smirk that followed. For 23 years, he had lived with Victoria's vanities, her insecurities, her casual cruelties. He had excused them, tolerated them, and funded them, writing them off as the unfortunate byproduct of the privileged world he had placed her in. But what he saw tonight was different. It wasn't just vanity, it was venom. It was the public, intentional humiliation of a young woman who was simply doing her job. But more than that, he saw the young woman herself. He saw her absorb the insult, the public shaming, and the cold, sticky wine without flinching, without crying, without shouting. He saw her respond with a calm, almost chilling professionalism that was more powerful than any angry retort could have been. He saw dignity. In that split second of eye contact, Robert Hartwell gave her an almost imperceptible nod. It was not a nod of pity or even apology. It was a nod of recognition, an acknowledgement from one powerful, controlled person to another. Jasmine registered the nod, filed it away, and broke eye contact. She turned her back on Victoria's smirking circle and walked, not ran, toward the kitchens. Her back was straight. Her head was high. She ignored the whispers that followed her, the sound of Victoria's high-pitched laugh starting up again. She was focused. In her apron pocket, her fingers brushed against the cool, hard metal of the small, high-fidelity digital recorder she carried for her thesis research. She clicked the small button in her pocket, ending the recording. She had the audio. She had the evidence. She had everything. She was unaware that the man at the head table, the true source of power in the room, was still watching her, his mind already calculating. As Jasmine passes Robert Hartwell's table, he observes her pass. What no one in that luxurious hall could imagine was that the simple waitress Victoria had just attacked held secrets that would turn this humiliation into the catalyst for a turnaround none of them would ever forget. "Did you see that?" Victoria gestured dramatically, a diamond bracelet sliding down her thin arm. Her voice was laden with theatrical indignation, loud enough to carry the absolute audacity. Jasmine had just returned from the staff kitchen, her heart rate finally steady. The kitchen manager, a gruff but fair man, had taken one look at her wine-soaked uniform, cursed under his breath, and found her a replacement. It was a men's-sized button-down, stiff and boxy, and the ill-fitting shoulders made her feel even more exposed than the stain had. As she stepped back into the gilded ballroom, she immediately felt the weight of their stares. Victoria, she saw, had not moved. Instead, she had gathered her perfect audience, a circle of high society women, including the formidable Margaret Wellington, who now hung on her every venomous word as if she were revealing the secrets of the universe. Jasmine tried to become invisible, focusing on her duty of refilling water glasses at a table adjacent to Victoria's circle. But it was impossible not to hear. Clearly, someone in the organization did not screen the staff properly, Victoria continued, her gaze flickering toward Jasmine. The audacity of some people, thinking they can just infiltrate our private events. It's a security risk, if you ask me. Margaret Wellington, an heiress to a pharmaceutical fortune, nodded vigorously, her jowls shaking. "Darling, you are absolutely right. Just yesterday, I had to dismiss a maid because she had the audacity to question my cleaning methods. These people simply must understand boundaries." Jasmine's hand was steady as she poured the water. She knew this performance. It wasn't for her benefit, it was for theirs. It was a ritual of reinforcing their own superiority by diminishing hers. Victoria, noticing Jasmine's proximity, saw a fresh opportunity and deliberately raised her voice, ensuring her next words would land with the force of a slap. "Anyway, girls, I suppose we shouldn't be too harsh," she said, feigning a magnanimous sigh. "After all, not everyone is lucky enough to be born with a silver spoon. Not everyone receives, well, a proper education." The phrase proper education hung in the air, aimed at Jasmine as precisely as a poisoned dart. She finished pouring the water, her movements economical and smooth, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. But Margaret Wellington, emboldened by Victoria's cruelty and the silent assent of the group, was not finished. She decided to add her own contribution to the public humiliation, turning to address Jasmine directly as the waitress began to move away. "Dear," Margaret called out, her voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that was far more insulting than outright anger. Jasmine stopped and turned, her face a polite, professional mask. "You do understand that the staff's job is to remain discreet, don't you? Blending into the background? Avoid, well, drawing unnecessary attention to oneself." The implication was clear. The wine incident, in their eyes, was her fault for being too noticeable. "Yes, ma'am," Jasmine replied, her voice quiet but firm. She met Margaret's gaze directly. "I understand perfectly." There was something in Jasmine's tone, a crisp articulation, a complete lack of servitude that made Margaret frown. It wasn't the response she'd expected. She had anticipated a mumbled, frightened apology. This was poise. Victoria Hartwell noticed her friend's hesitation and felt a flash of irritation. This little waitress was proving resilient. It was time to end the game. "Margaret is right," Victoria said, standing up from her chair. She moved toward Jasmine, a cruel, tight smile on her face. She was a predator closing in. "In fact, perhaps we should have a quick chat about proper protocol. You can read, can't you?" The question was so openly malicious, so calculated in its racism, that an awkward silence spread to the tables nearby. Guests who had been trying to ignore the drama now turned to watch, shocked. Jasmine felt dozens of eyes fix on her, waiting for her to crumble. "Yes, ma'am," Jasmine replied again, her voice maintaining the same impossible professional calm. But something in her eyes had changed. A small, cold light now shone from them. "I read perfectly well." Victoria let out a high-pitched, unpleasant laugh. "Great," she chirped. "Then maybe you can read this for us." She snatched the event menu from the nearest table. It was a masterpiece of pretentious printing, heavy cream-colored cardstock, embossed with the hotel's crest, and filled, as Victoria knew, with complex, untranslatable French culinary terms. It was a document designed to impress the elite and intimidate everyone else. She held it out to Jasmine. "Out loud," Victoria commanded, her smile widening, "so we can all be sure that the service staff understands exactly what is being served to the important guest tonight." It was a trap, plain and simple. It was a public test designed for only one outcome: spectacular failure. Victoria wanted to force Jasmine to expose herself, to stutter and stumble over words she couldn't possibly know, or to refuse and give Victoria a reason to call security and have her thrown out. From the head table, Robert Hartwell watched the scene unfold with a growing wave of acidic shame. This was no longer a simple, catty remark or a passive-aggressive snub. This was a public execution, a spectacle of cruelty orchestrated by his own wife. He saw the menu in Victoria's hand, and he knew exactly what she was doing. He had glanced at it earlier. It was offensively pretentious, a document designed by a chef who cared more for vocabulary than food. He knew Victoria, who struggled with anything beyond basic high school French, couldn't pronounce half the words on it. She wasn't testing the waitress's knowledge. She was banking on her ignorance. He saw the other guests, his colleagues, his competitors, the city's old money all watching. Some looked away, embarrassed for everyone involved, but most watched with the rapt, hungry attention of Romans at a gladiator match. This was his wife, his partner, the woman who bore his name, acting like a common street bully in a $1,000 designer gown, and she was doing it at his table at an event he was co-chairing. He looked at the young waitress, Jasmine. She was trapped in a spotlight of pure malice, her face pale but her back still ramrod straight. He saw her knuckles, white as she gripped her serving tray. She was a kid, probably, trying to earn tuition. The imbalance of power was grotesque. It was too much. This had to stop. Robert placed his linen napkin firmly on the table and began to push his heavy chair back. A low murmur of, "Victoria, that is quite enough," forming on his lips. He would shut this down, apologize to the young woman, and deal with his wife's tantrum later. But before his chair could even scrape the floor, the waitress Jasmine moved. She did not cower. She did not burst into tears. She did not look to him or anyone else for rescue. With a hand that was perfectly unnervingly steady, she reached out and took the heavy cardstock menu from Victoria's grip. Her fingers brushed Victoria's, a simple professional contact. But it caused Victoria to flinch as if she'd been burned by the waitress's audacity. Jasmine held the menu. She did not look at it immediately. Instead, she lifted her chin and held Victoria's gaze, and the polite professional mask she had worn all night through the wine, through the insults, through the stares, finally dissolved. It was replaced by something else. Something Victoria Hartwell had never seen directed at her in her entire, pampered life. A look of calm, clinical, and complete confidence. For the first time that evening, a small, genuine smile touched the corner of Jasmine's mouth. It was not a smile of fear or of submission. It was the smile of a chess player who just realized her opponent has fallen for the trap. "With pleasure, ma'am." To the utter surprise of everyone present, Jasmine began to read the menu. She didn't just read it, she performed it. The moment the first French word left her lips, the hesitant, polite mask of the waitress vanished. In her place stood a scholar, her voice ringing out in the deafening, expectant silence of the ballroom. It was a voice that was clear, melodic, and resonated with a perfect, Parisian-learned French pronunciation. Victoria's cruel, confident smile was frozen in place, her eyes wide, her brain visibly struggling to process the sounds she was hearing. She was waiting for the stutter, the mispronunciation, the inevitable, humiliating failure. It never came. "Amuse-bouche de crabe royal," Jasmine began, her voice flowing like music, her accent pure, unforced, and utterly authentic. "Suivi par le consommé parmentier aux truffes noires du Périgord." A low murmur rippled through the nearby tables. This was no longer a spectacle of humiliation, it was a spectacle of brilliance. People who had been watching with detached pity were now leaning forward, their expressions shifting to astonishment. An older gentleman at a corner table, notorious for his snobbery and his villa in Nice, actually lowered his glasses, his jaw slightly slack. He recognized that accent. It wasn't just good French, learned from a textbook. It was the fluid, effortless French of someone who had lived there. Victoria's smile didn't just fade, it collapsed. Her face, a moment ago flushed with triumph, was rapidly turning a pale, mottled white. This was impossible. This was a waitress. A black waitress in a borrowed uniform. She was supposed to stumble, to blush, to mumble, "I'm sorry, ma'am, I can't." She was not supposed to sound like she'd been born in the 6th arrondissement of Paris. But Jasmine was fluent. The complex, pretentious terms that Victoria saw as a class-based weapon were, to Jasmine, simply, dinner. She had learned this pronunciation not from a high school class, but during a grueling 2-year academic merit scholarship exchange program in Lyon. She hadn't just studied, she had survived. She had worked in a real bistro kitchen to support her studies, arguing with chefs and taking orders from demanding patrons. She knew the precise difference between a Parmentier and a Périgord because she had cooked them, served them, and written papers on their economic history. She continued, her voice gaining strength, savoring the poetic, delicious absurdity of the moment. She read every pretentious description, every obscure ingredient, every grand, ridiculous title, her pronunciation flawless. Le filet de bœuf en croûte, sauce madère. Robert Hartwell, who had been halfway out of his chair, slowly sat back down. His shame was eclipsed by a profound electric shock of admiration. He wasn't just watching a waitress defend herself. He was watching a professional execution. Jasmine's voice reached its crescendo, clear and final. Et pour terminer, le grand triomphe au chocolat, accompagné d'une glace à la vanille de Madagascar. She finished. The silence that followed was heavier and more profound than the one that had preceded it. It was a silence of pure, unadulterated shock. Victoria Hartwell's trap had not just failed. It had snapped back and captured its architect in front of the entire Boston elite. Jasmine lowered the heavy menu card. She held it out, not to the table, but directly back to Victoria. The gesture was polite, professional, and utterly devastating. Victoria, who was still standing, stared at the proffered menu as if it were a venomous snake. Her arm, however, seemed to move of its own accord, rising mechanically to take it. Her fingers were stiff, her knuckles white. With the menu now back in her tormentor's hand, Jasmine offered a small, serene smile. "I hope that was helpful, ma'am," she said, her voice still respectful, but the clinical confidence beneath it was unmistakable. The silence that followed was deafening, absolute. The string quartet had, at some point, stopped playing. The only sound in the grand ballroom was the distant clatter of a dish from the kitchens. Victoria stood frozen, holding the menu, her mouth slightly open. She was, for the first time in her adult life, completely and utterly speechless. Every cruel retort, every dismissive sneer, every ounce of her carefully constructed social power had evaporated. She had tried to expose Jasmine as an uneducated fraud, and in front of everyone, she had instead exposed only herself. It was impossible for anyone watching, from the snobbish gentleman at the corner table to Margaret Wellington, who was now staring at her shoes, to deny the truth. This simple waitress possessed a level of education, poise, and sophistication that rivaled, or perhaps even surpassed, anyone else in that room. The hunter had become the prey, and the victory was total, public, and undeniable. Victoria's face was no longer pale. It was a blotchy, humiliating red. She looked around desperately for support, but her friends, including Margaret, suddenly found their wine glasses or the ceiling's architecture intensely fascinating. No one would meet her eye. She had overplayed her hand so spectacularly that she had made herself a social liability. In their world, cruelty was acceptable. Being caught and humiliated by one's inferior was not. Jasmine held her gaze for one more second, a second that seemed to stretch into an eternity, before giving a slight, polite nod, as if concluding a simple transaction. She then turned her back straight and began to walk away, the sound of her sensible work shoes clicking softly on the marble floor. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The battle was won. It was at that moment, as Jasmine walked away from the wreckage, that Robert Hartwell finally arrived at the table. He had remained seated, stunned during Jasmine's performance, but now he moved. He did not look at his wife. Instead, his eyes followed Jasmine as she departed. His gaze was no longer just respectful. It was filled with a profound, calculating admiration. This was the kind of poise he respected in a boardroom, the kind of quiet steel that won impossible negotiations. To find it here, in this young woman, in this uniform, under this kind of fire, it was extraordinary. He made a mental note. He would find out who she was. He finally turned his attention to his wife. Victoria, realizing she had been abandoned by her friends and defeated by her victim, was visibly trembling with a toxic mixture of humiliation and rage. She saw her husband approaching, and she scrambled to regain control, to reframe the narrative. "Robert, dear," she said, her voice a high-pitched, brittle thing. "I was just ensuring the staff understood the protocols, making sure everything was perfect for your event." Robert looked at her, his face as unreadable as it had been at the start of the night, but his voice was soft and as cold as the imported ice chilling the champagne. "Victoria," he said, and the quiet authority in that single word made her flinch. "Perhaps it's time we focus on the real purpose of this evening. Charity." He did not raise his voice. He did not admonish her publicly, but the warning was clear, and it was final. He was not on her side. He turned, giving a brief, polite nod to Margaret Wellington and the other women, who still looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, and walked back to the head table, leaving Victoria standing alone in the circle of her own making. Jasmine nodded respectfully to Robert as he passed, a silent acknowledgement of his intervention, however late, and continued on her route. She needed to get back to work. She had trays to carry, glasses to fill, but the atmosphere around her had shifted. The whispers that followed her now were not of pity, but of awe. She was no longer the invisible waitress. She was the woman who had publicly silenced Victoria Hartwell. As Jasmine disappeared into the crowd, Margaret Wellington finally found her voice, leaning nervously toward Victoria. "Darling," she whispered, her hand fluttering to her pearls. "My goodness. Perhaps, perhaps we misjudged the situation. That, that was rather incredible." Victoria Hartwell, defeated but not broken, finally let her mask of social grace fall completely. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She grabbed Margaret's arm, her nails digging into the woman's expensive silk sleeve, causing her to yelp. "We misjudged nothing," Victoria hissed, her voice a low, venomous promise. "A few cheap parlor tricks don't change who she is. She's a nobody." She stared at Jasmine's retreating form, her eyes narrowing to slits. "And before this night is over, I will make sure everyone in this room understands that. Perfectly." "Jasmine, are you all right?" The voice was quiet, firm and respectful. It cut through the high adrenaline ringing in her ears. She had escaped the ballroom not because she was afraid or defeated, but because she needed a moment to reset. Victoria's hissed promise from across the room had reached her, and she knew this night was far from over. She had taken refuge in the alcove leading to the hotel's opulent restrooms, a quiet corridor lined with marble and dim, elegant sconces. She was dabbing at the still damp patches on her ill-fitting replacement uniform, not with fear, but with a cold, controlled anger. She was checking the digital recorder in her pocket, ensuring the file from the French menu confrontation was saved and secure, when the voice spoke. She looked up, startled, into the eyes of Robert Hartwell. He stood alone in the hallway, his hands clasped in front of him, his posture almost apologetic. He was not invading her space but blocking her exit. Jasmine's guard went up instantly. This was the husband, the enabler, the man who funded the diamonds and the cruelty. She braced herself for a different kind of attack, a payoff perhaps, or a quiet threat to protect his wife's reputation. But Robert Hartwell did not threaten. His expression was one of genuine, profound concern. I apologize," he said, and the sincerity in his voice was jarring. "For my wife's behavior, her public behavior. It was utterly unacceptable. There is no justification for it." Jasmine studied him carefully. In her 24 years, and especially in her MBA program, she had become an expert at distinguishing condescending pity from genuine respect. In Robert's eyes, she saw something she rarely found in white men of his position, real, unadulterated shame, and it was directed squarely at his own family. She gave a small professional nod. She was still an employee, and this was still a delicate situation. "Mr. Hartwell, I appreciate your concern, but you need not feel responsible for your wife's actions." "Of course I do," Robert replied, his voice firm, his gaze unflinching. "I am responsible for what I tolerate, and I have tolerated that behavior for far too long." He paused, looking at her with an intense analytical curiosity, the same look he'd had at the table. "That was quite incredible. Your French is better than my professors at Yale. You're not really a waitress, are you?" Jasmine allowed herself a small, wry smile. The question, "You're not really a waitress, are you?" was one she had heard before, usually after she'd helped a customer's child with an advanced math problem or discussed a nuance of fiscal policy with a diner patron. The uniform was a cloak of invisibility. People were always shocked to find a person inside it. "I am a waitress, Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice even. "It's an honorable job. It's helping me pay my tuition. But it's not what I'm studying." Robert leaned against the marble wall, his curiosity clearly piqued. "And what are you studying, if you don't mind my asking?" "I'm an MBA student at Harvard," Jasmine stated simply. Robert's practiced, neutral expression faltered. His eyes widened, just slightly. but it was the most emotion she had seen from him all night. Harvard, he repeated, not as a question, but as an affirmation. He processed this new information, the implications of it. The woman his wife had just tried to humiliate for being uneducated, for being this kind of people, was currently attending one of the most elite graduate programs on earth. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. He let out a short, sharp sigh that was almost a laugh. My goodness, Victoria, she has no idea. He looked at her with new, intense interest. An MBA. What's your specialization? Finance? Logistics? Analysis of systemic discrimination in corporate environments, Jasmine replied. I'm currently finishing my thesis. Robert, who had been pushing himself off the wall, froze. This second revelation seemed to hit him harder than the first. Your what? My thesis, Jasmine elaborated, her voice taking on the confidence of her academic self, is on the impact of racial and class-based microaggressions in elite professional settings. How subtle, often unrecorded acts of prejudice create a hostile environment that stifles minority talent and costs companies billions in potential. Robert Hartwell stared at her. He was no longer just a husband ashamed of his wife. He was a CEO, a mogul, a man who dealt in risk, assets, and human capital. And this young woman was, in one stroke, describing the single biggest, most unfixable problem he was facing at his own company. He thought of the internal reports he'd read, the HR complaints, the promising minority hires who had quit after less than a year. He thought of the board's recent urgent push for a real diversity initiative, not just cosmetic changes. Racial microaggressions, he repeated, tasting the academic phrase. Like what just happened out there. What happened out there, Jasmine corrected gently, wasn't a microaggression, Mr. Hartwell. That was just plain, old-fashioned, overt aggression. My thesis covers the ones people don't see. Robert Hartwell was silent for a long moment, but his mind was racing. He was a man who had built an empire by recognizing patterns and acting on opportunities before his competitors did, and the universe had just, in the most bizarre and humiliating way, gift-wrapped an opportunity and placed it right in front of him. The problem he was facing at Hartwell Development was real. The board was pushing for a genuine audit, not another sensitivity training seminar led by an HR consultant who would tell them what they wanted to hear. They needed someone who understood the problem from the inside out, someone who understood both the theory and the brutal, first-hand reality. Jasmine, he said, his voice low and urgent, this may sound strange. It might sound impulsive, but I assure you, it is not. He gestured from the alcove toward a secluded, quiet seating area in the hotel lobby, away from the prying eyes and ears of the gala. Please walk with me for a moment. What you just said, and it's exactly what my company is dealing with. Jasmine, though wary, recognized the shift. This was no longer an apology, it was a business proposition. She followed him to the small area, two plush armchairs sitting forgotten near a tall potted palm. My company, Hartwell Development, Robert said, sitting on the edge of the chair, is facing serious diversity and retention issues. We hire top talent, including from your school, and we lose them. The board is pushing for real change, not just cosmetic fixes. We need a thorough, top-to-bottom audit of our hiring practices, our promotion structures, and our corporate culture. We need to know what's really happening. He looked at her directly, his gaze intense. I need someone with your expertise, someone who understands systemic discrimination, as you said, someone who can see what my VPs, including myself, are blind to. I am offering you a position, Miss Washington, a paid high-level consulting position, effective immediately. You would report directly to me. You would have full autonomy to conduct your audit, access to all our data, and your conclusions would be presented directly to the board. Jasmine was stunned into silence. 20 minutes ago, she was a stained waitress being humiliated for sport. Now the husband of her tormentor was offering her the exact kind of job her entire MBA had been preparing her for. It was a professional dream, delivered from the ashes of a personal nightmare. Mr. Hartwell, she began. That's very generous, but It's not generosity, Robert interrupted, holding up a hand. It's self-interest. My company is bleeding talent, and you have the precise skill set I need to fix it. This is a business offer. Before Jasmine could formally accept, a voice like acid cut through the quiet lobby. Robert, dear. Victoria Hartwell stood at the entrance to the seating area. Her face, which had been pale with shock after the French menu incident, was now a mask of pure, cold fury. She had clearly been looking for her husband, and finding him here, in a private, earnest conversation with her, was an unforgivable transgression. What are you doing here? With her. Victoria, I'm offering Jasmine a position as a consultant at the company. Robert's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a simple statement of fact. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, a physical weight in the small lobby. Victoria Hartwell looked from her husband to Jasmine, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. This was impossible. This was a rebellion. Her husband, her provider, was siding with the help. You're joking, Victoria finally said. But it wasn't a question. It was a desperate plea. She forced a high-pitched, nervous laugh. Robert, don't be ridiculous. She's a waitress. She is an MBA student at Harvard, Victoria, Robert replied, his voice still dangerously quiet. He stood up, placing himself subtly between his wife and Jasmine. She is specializing in the exact area where our company is failing. The woman you publicly humiliated in front of my board members and competitors is, as it turns in, uniquely qualified to fix a multi-million-dollar problem I have. Victoria visibly paled. Harvard, she whispered. The word hit her like a physical blow. The French, the poise. It all clicked into place, and the realization only fueled her rage. This wasn't just a random girl. This was an educated, dangerous rival. She immediately switched tactics, turning her venom from her husband to Jasmine, but coating it in a sickening, false sweetness. Darling, Victoria said, stepping toward Jasmine, I'm sure you understand. Sometimes at these social events, misunderstandings happen. Things are said in jest. I'm sure an intelligent girl like you wouldn't want to make trouble over a simple misunderstanding. Perhaps we should all just forget tonight ever happened. It was a blatant attempt at intimidation, a veiled threat disguised as a truce. Know your place. Don't take this offer. Don't cross me. Jasmine, however, did not back down. She looked at Victoria, her gaze as clinical and calm as a surgeon's. Ms. Hartwell, thank you for clarifying, she said, her voice clear and strong. But there was no misunderstanding. Your comments were very clear and very direct. Victoria's smile faltered. Of course, dear, she stammered. But intelligent people like you, surely you understand social context. Intelligent people, Jasmine interrupted, her voice polite but razor-sharp, cutting through Victoria's condescending tone. Especially those with my academic background tend to be very precise about context and meaning. We value data. We value facts. She held Victoria's gaze, which was now flickering with uncertainty. And we are especially precise when it comes to analyzing documented racial discrimination. The word hung in the air. Documented. It was a strange academic word to use in a hotel lobby. But to Victoria, it sounded like a gunshot. It was a legal term, a term of evidence. Her forced smile froze, then collapsed. Robert Hartwell, who had been watching the exchange with the clinical detachment of a CEO, caught it instantly. He saw the color drain from his wife's face. He knew his wife. He knew her arrogance. But he also knew, and was suddenly terrified of, her carelessness. Victoria, Robert said, his voice no longer cold but sharp with sudden, dawning horror. What did you do? Were you recorded? Victoria stammered. Recorded? Don't be absurd, Robert. It was just chatter. But Jasmine didn't need to say a word. Her action said everything. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into the pocket of her ill-fitting replacement uniform, the one she had been given after Victoria had ruined her first. Her hand emerged holding a small, sleek digital audio recorder. It was no bigger than a stick of gum, but in that moment, it was the heaviest object in the room. She didn't point it. She didn't wave it. She simply held it in the palm of her hand under the soft lobby light. She pressed a small button on the side. The tiny red recording light, which had been on, blinked once and went out. Victoria Hartwell made a small sound, a high-pitched gasp, like air escaping a punctured tire. She stared at the small black device as if it were a bomb. It was no longer a misunderstanding. It wasn't chatter. It was evidence. It was her voice, her words, people like you. Proper education, all captured, all saved. It was not just social gossip. It was a potential lawsuit. It was the end of her reputation, the end of her charity board positions, the end of everything. Robert Hartwell looked at the small black device in Jasmine's hand. He looked at his wife's horrified, guilty face, and then he looked back at Jasmine's calm, steady expression. In that single terrible moment, he understood everything. He understood the dignity he had seen earlier. It wasn't just poise, it was strategy. This young woman hadn't just endured the attack. She had processed it, filed it, and documented it, all in real time. She hadn't been a victim. She had been a researcher, and Victoria had just handed her the perfect case study. Victoria, seeing her husband's cold, calculating expression, finally broke. "Robert, please," she begged, her voice now a desperate, ugly whisper. She trapped me. This is entrapment. You can't. Robert, do something." Robert Hartwell did do something. He stood up to his full height, buttoning his tuxedo jacket. He did not look at his wife. He looked only at Jasmine. "Ms. Washington," he said, his voice as formal as if they were in a boardroom. "My assistant will contact you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp with a formal contract and preliminary onboarding materials." This was the checkmate. He wasn't just ignoring his wife's plea. He was confirming the job offer after seeing the evidence. He was rewarding Jasmine for her competence and, in the same breath, passing judgment on his wife. He then turned to Victoria, and his expression was one she had never seen before. It was not anger. It was not disappointment. It was finality. It was the look he gave a bad investment before he cut his losses. "Victoria," he said, his voice flat, "we are going home. Now." He began to walk toward the exit, not waiting to see if she would follow. Victoria stood frozen for another second, her world collapsing. She looked at Jasmine, her eyes filled with a hatred so profound it was almost animalistic, before spinning on her heel and hurrying after her husband. Jasmine stood alone in the quiet lobby, the digital recorder still warm in her hand. As Robert and a ghost-white, trembling Victoria walked away, she could hear the beginning of a cold, quiet, and devastating argument. "How could you be so stupid, Victoria?" Robert's low voice carried back. "How could you be so careless?" Victoria, too late, realized she had attacked the wrong person, at the wrong time, and had personally handed her the exact evidence she needed to burn her world to the ground. Jasmine finally let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She was safe. She had won. 3 weeks later, Victoria Hartwell's world had crumbled. The audio recording had never been leaked to the press. It never had to be. Jasmine, true to her academic purpose, had provided the file only to Robert Hartwell as evidence for his internal corporate audit. But Robert had used it for one other purpose. He played the full, unedited 23-minute file from the initial "oops" to the French menu debacle for the executive board of the charity gala. The silence in that boardroom, he later told Jasmine, was more profound than the one in the ballroom. Victoria was not just asked to step down, her membership was revoked. The news spread through the Boston elite like fire. It wasn't the overt racism that truly horrified them. It was the evidence. It was the getting caught. Victoria, the queen bee, had become a pariah. Her friends, including Margaret Wellington, suddenly stopped returning her calls. Invitations to Thanksgiving and Christmas parties evaporated. She was socially ruined. Robert had not returned to the master bedroom. He moved into the guest wing of their massive Brookline home and had his lawyers file for a formal separation. The humiliation, he had told her, was not just that she was cruel, but that she was reckless, and he could not have recklessness associated with his name or his company. Meanwhile, Jasmine Washington was thriving. She walked through the glass and steel lobby of Hartwell Development, not as a waitress, but as a senior consultant. Dressed in a sharp professional suit, she carried a leather briefcase, not a serving tray. Robert Hartwell had been true to his word. She had full access, a direct line to him, and the complete, terrified cooperation of the HR department. She was leading her first diversity and inclusion audit meeting, commanding the attention of VPs twice her age, her voice as calm and authoritative as it had been when she read the French menu. She was no longer just analyzing systemic discrimination. She was in a position of power to finally fix it. Victoria, desperate, broken, and completely isolated, managed to get a message to Jasmine through Robert's executive assistant. The email was short, devoid of the flowery language she once used. It didn't ask for forgiveness. It simply begged for 5 minutes of her time. "I need to apologize in person," it read. "Please." Jasmine, after a day of consideration, agreed. She chose the location, a quiet, neutral cafe in Cambridge, nestled between university bookstores, far from the prying eyes of Victoria's former Beacon Hill social circle. It was a place where Victoria Hartwell, the socialite, would be an anonymous face, just another person. When Victoria walked in, Jasmine almost didn't recognize her. The immaculate blonde hair, usually coiffed into a perfect helmet-like style, was pulled back in a simple, messy bun. She wore no makeup, and her eyes, stripped of their usual smoky shadow, were puffy, red, and aged. The armor of her wealth, the diamonds, the custom-tailored Chanel, the cruel smirk was gone. She was just a woman in a simple black sweater and jeans, looking smaller, older, and utterly defeated. She sat down, her hands trembling so much she clasped them together on the table. She didn't order anything. "Ms. Washington." "Jasmine," she stammered, the words sounding foreign and rusty on her tongue. "Thank you for coming. I know you didn't have to." Jasmine simply nodded, her face professional and calm, waiting. She had not come here for Victoria's sake. She had come for her own, to close the loop on her research. I wanted to apologize," Victoria began, the tears welling up instantly. She looked down at her clasped hands, too ashamed to meet Jasmine's gaze. "What I did to you, it wasn't just cruel. It was hateful. It was ugly. She choked on a sob. "I don't even know why I did it. You were just doing your job. You were graceful. And I think it made me angry. I was arrogant, and I am so deeply, deeply ashamed." A tear rolled down her cheek and dripped onto the table. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, a gesture so raw and unpolished that Jasmine was momentarily taken aback. "I know I've lost everything," Victoria continued, her voice a broken whisper. "Robert he's gone. He's proceeding with the separation. My friends, my charity boards, they're gone. And I deserve it. I know that. I'm not here to ask you to fix any of that." She finally looked up, her eyes pleading, red-rimmed and desperate. "I have one request, that recording. I know you gave it to Robert for the company, but please, I'm begging you, don't release it to the press. Don't post it online. I'm already ruined. Please, just don't destroy what little is left of my family. My children. They have to go to school. They're already hearing the whispers. Please, don't make it permanent. Don't let this be the only thing they ever know about their mother." Jasmine listened, her expression unreadable. She saw the woman who had tried to destroy her, now completely, pathetically at her mercy. She had the power. The justice the internet would crave, the total, viral annihilation of Victoria Hartwell, was sitting on her phone, just one click away. Jasmine looked at the woman who had, just 3 weeks ago, tried to professionally and personally annihilate her. She had the power in that single moment to exact a final, devastating revenge. She could leak the audio and make Victoria Hartwell a global symbol of racist arrogance. She could destroy her name, her children's name, and any chance of a future she had left. The justice the world seemed to crave was sitting in her coat pocket, just one click away. Victoria watched her, holding her breath, her face pale and streaked with tears. She was completely at Jasmine's mercy. After a long, heavy silence, Jasmine finally spoke. "You're right, Miss Hartwell," she said, her voice quiet but not unkind. You were cruel. And what you're experiencing now, that's justice, the consequences of your own actions. Victoria flinched, expecting the final blow. But, Jasmine continued, my work is about changing systems. It's about fixing the corporate cultures that allow people like you to act that way without fear. My thesis isn't about destroying individuals. She reached into her bag. Victoria tensed, her eyes locking onto Jasmine's hand. But Jasmine didn't pull out a phone. She pulled out the small black digital recorder, the same one from the hotel lobby. Jasmine held it in her hand, between them on the table. She slid it across the table so Victoria could see it clearly. Then while Victoria watched, Jasmine pressed the menu button, navigated to the file marked Gala Hartwell Audio, and held down the delete button. Erase file, the tiny screen asked. She pressed OK. The screen flashed. File deleted. Victoria let out a sound, a choked, disbelieving sob. She stared at the recorder, then at Jasmine, her eyes wide with a new, different kind of shock. It was the shock of unearned mercy. Why? She whispered. You've learned your lesson, Jasmine said simply, placing the recorder back in her bag. She stood up, zipping her coat. My job offer from Robert wasn't dependent on that file. My work is what matters. She looked down at the broken woman. I have no use for it anymore. You have to live with what you did. I'm going to focus on making sure no one has to live through it again. Victoria watched her, speechless. Jasmine walked out of the cafe, leaving Victoria Hartwell alone with her coffee, her shame, and the unexpected, startling gift of grace. Jasmine stepped into the bright, cold Boston afternoon, her head held high, not looking back. She was ready to build a better future, proving that turning humiliation into purpose and choosing grace over revenge was the only victory that truly mattered. That night in Boston was never really about the spilled wine. It was about two kinds of power. Victoria's power, built on arrogance and prejudice, proved to be as fragile as the glass she dropped. But Jasmine's strength rooted in her intelligence, her dignity, and ultimately, her capacity for grace was unbreakable. In the end, by choosing forgiveness instead of revenge, Jasmine didn't just secure justice for herself. She taught all of us a profound lesson that a person's true worth is always found in their character, never in the uniform they happen to wear.